My name is Priya Chauhan, and I'm the curator of Shape of a Thought, Letters from Ram Kumar, the centenary showcase that the Museum of Art and Photography has brought forth to honor one of India's most celebrated modernists. This exhibition takes us beyond the familiar image of Ram Kumar as a painter of abstract landscapes. It brings into focus his other dimensions as well, as a writer, a thinker, and an observer of the world, allowing us to see the fuller picture of his practice and his life and where it's placed in this thing we call modernism. And it is in conjunction with this exhibition that we host today's talk. Our session titled Revisiting Midnight's Moderns turns our attention to the progressive artists group, arguably the most high profile figures of Indian modernism and their enduring presence in our cultural and critical imagination. So, what continues to fascinate us about these artists of India's early independence years, and how do their ideals resonate or resist the questions? These are the kind of things that we are asking of art today, and we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Zehra Jumoban to lead this exploration. Dr. Zehra is lecturer in the History of Art department at the University of Bristol, UK, and inaugural recipient of the Berger Trust Future Leaders Fellowship in the History of British Art for 2025 and 2026. She completed her doctorate at the Courtauld Institute of Art at London, where she also lectured extensively. And many of you will know her from her landmark exhibition, The Progressive Revolution, a modern art for a new India at the Asia Society in New York in 2018. And later this year, she will co-curate Krishen Khanna at 100, the last progressive at NGME Mumbai. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zehra.
Yeah, thank you, Priya. This is really an exciting opportunity. And I kind of jumped at it because, I was looking at your exhibition, um, which looks really fascinating. And it kind of got me thinking about what Kajali Khanna, who is Krishan's granddaughter, and I are curating his big retrospective. He's 100 years old this year. And it kind of got me thinking, from the time of the Progressive Revolution, which was 2018. And I've always, since then, not necessarily something that I enjoy, but um, anything else I've curated has totally been forgotten by the Indian art world. Even when I'm curating it, they introduce me as, oh, Zara, that's the progressive girl. So, this has been a shadow hanging over me, a shadow or like maybe something, a nice cloud. But it really got me thinking about, when you all said, do you think you could kind of revisit this lecture, midnight and modern Indian art? And I sort of redid that lecture a little bit. I wasn't intending to, but I started like thinking about, what is it about the progressives that when I did that show in 2018, um, I felt that it was kind of an end point. I thought after this, we're no longer going to be so obsessed with the progressives, because part of what that show was doing, and I'll show you a little bit about that, was kind of defining who they were, their close associates who sometimes we put under the same category. And I thought in a kind of way it sort of drew a line under that so that we could open up other dialogues. And yet I've still always been known as the progressive girl. And that whole the weight of the progressives, which was the question that, when Bunhui and I were curating it, we were asking, why the progressives, is still very much there. So yeah, I do think that actually the way in which we're looking at the progressives has changed. And the reason I'm saying that is also, Priya, your show with Ram Kumar is kind of in a particular trajectory, which I think all of us have sort of gone through, which is first looking at at the progressives as a collective, and then slowly going much more deep dive into maybe one particular member or associate, and kind of trying to unpick for ourselves, and in a much more Indian context, what the significance of this one artist and oeuvre actually is. So I'm starting with revisiting the Midnight's Moderns, and as you can see here, this is a work that is a collaborative Zari work by Nalini Malani and a Pakistani artist and also art historian. So he's better known as an art historian, Iftikhar Dadi. So I thought it was a good place to kind of just start with the Midnight's lines, as it were. The formation of India and Pakistan and the Radcliffe line. So don't know what's happening with me. Okay, so this is obviously the Radcliffe line, and if you look on the right, you've got Bangladesh, but it wasn't Bangladesh at that point. It was called East Pakistan in 1947, and you have West Pakistan, and the line that continues to divide. Pakistan and India. So this is the line that for Indians and Pakistanis and for Indian art keeps getting repeated. And I'll kind of come back to this motif of midnight, and come back to the motif of the Radcliffe lines as I sort of wind up the talk, and show you, in a sense, how some of the deep dives that are happening into individual members of the progressives, um, or their very close associates, actually shed light on this 1947 partition. Um, and this particularly happens, I will argue, in the 70s. So I've located it as well. And Priya, I'll need a little bit of help at some point when I'm kind of winding up as to the significance of one particular Ram Kumar picture that you've got, a photograph that you've got in your show, which is from 1971, and it's a protest picture. So I kind of wanted to know what that protest was about, because obviously I've gone and interpreted it in the light of what I'm finding with the Krishen Khanna archives. Okay, so here is the sort of stroke of midnight and the kind of questions that this particular talk is asking. So at the stroke of midnight, while the world slumbered, India emerged to life and freedom. So this term, life and freedom, is very much an Nehru's term. At the dawn of the nation state and imbued with Nehru's secular-syncretic aspirations, the progressive artist group was formed in, and I've deliberately put Bombay rather than Mumbai because it was Bombay at that point, with all the sort of cosmopolitan backdrop and a kind of British imperial backdrop to that freedom. Often considered India's most high profile moderns, the PAG continues to haunt the Indian imagination. But why this continuing obsession with these early figures of India's awakening? How helpful is the PAG's aesthetic vision as a bulwark against current rigid definitions? And of course, with the sort of the double-sided pun on the word right, are we really asking the right questions of them? And this is something that I'd be really happy to discuss. Is Are we asking the right questions? And what is, in some sense, while the auction houses continue to go crazy with anyone who's associated with the progressive artist group, has multi $1 million capacity. But I mean, why is our generation so obsessed, right? Even those of us who are not really that involved with any auction houses, why is this perpetual sort of haunting, and what are the questions that we're, we're trying to get answered here? um so this is a little picture from your exhibition, Shape of a Thought, Letters from Ram Kumar. So like really deep dive, as you said, into like one snippet of his relationship. I just wanted people to pay attention to some of the iconography that we're finding here. So, like the really early work. And it's really quite exciting to me. I'll now talk to you about the Progressive Revolution as an exhibition and some of the kind of dating that we were trying to do with it via the archives. And if you just like look at this particular head by Ram Kumar, you'll see huge synergies with the kind of early aesthetic of the sort of 40s, 50s progressive artist group. So these are a few slides from the exhibition itself. And we had this big quote up there. Uh, I mean, you have to remember that the Asia Society exhibition happens in New York, right? And it's in a very sort of prestigious part of New York that is really the heartland of um, the modernist dialogue because uh, the Asia Society Museum is basically the brainchild in 1956. It was formed by J.D. Rockefeller III. Now, the reason that he gets so interested in Asian art is because his father and mother, Abby Aldrich, who then marries J.D. Rockefeller II, are pivotal in modern art per se. So European and American art. So it's the Rockefellers, particularly led by an Abby Aldrich, who are instrumental in the MoMA, they're instrumental in the Met. So there's this entire legacy with the Asia Society Museum, with JD the Third trying to make his own imprint in the aesthetic dialogue for political reasons as well, right? I mean, this was all a kind of for the Rockefellers, a kind of whitewash of where their money had come from, which was the Standard Oil Company. So this building itself had a particular kind of resonance and significance, and it was kind of some. A double mission that Bun Hui, who is now the late Bun Hui, Bun Hui and I were friends from Singapore. And when he became director of the Asia Society Museum, he's always been like a huge India buff. He and I had tea together in London in a halfway point, and we really decided we'd like to do an exhibition on the Indian moderns and talk about the secular and talk about the syncretic. And this was a point at which you had the right kind of rising, even in an American context, but certainly in an Indian context. So one of the things we were trying to do was we were trying to look at where Indian modernism fit within a Western art historical dialogue, and what we'd found both with Bunhui's analysis of, certain Chinese artists, and with the Indian moderns is that in the West, they were still struggling for a place within art history. So we wanted this show to actually give not just complete context to an audience that was walking in. It's on 7th Avenue. So, like, you have all kinds of an audience walking in. But the all kinds being, the all kinds that will pay $25 to come into a museum. So, it's a pretty elite audience, but it's a very, very wide audience. So, they're not going to know that much about Indian art. And there are lots of there were a lot of prejudices at that point. One of which being, ironically, which we were trying to subvert really strongly, was that the Rockefellers never collected Indian art. So this was I've never collected modern Indian art. So this was one of the myths that we were actually, as we did research for the show, we realized totally not true. And that's because in the permanent collection of the Asia Society Museum, you had antiquities. So, ironically, it was sort of taken for granted that entire dialogue was the Rockefellers, so important within the dialogue of a modern in a Euro-American context, really didn't rate Indian art at all. It didn't fit into that dialogue. They never even collected it, and it certainly never made it to their museum. Only antiquities made it to their museum of the Asia Society's permanent collection. So this was not true, but it was also something we were trying to debunk. So for one thing we were trying to debunk was we were really trying to insert the Indian modern into a global art history. But the other thing that became really clear is that the more research that we did, and the more kind of field trips that I did out there, um, both in India, both in Bombay and in Delhi, um, I kept getting the same responses like, Zara, you have the chance to do anything out there. Why are you still obsessed with the progressive artist group? Everybody knows, in an Indian context, everybody knows everything about them. So why are you so hung up on this? And then I realized that the more I asked, right, it was like, who belongs to the progressive artist group? Everybody's, the seminal market experts would all come up with a different answer, and usually an answer that suited them, right? So I'll show you in a minute the people who generally get considered part of the group. And so again, like, so the second part of this endeavor became, actually, let's go back and track who was really part of this group. Let's just do like a straightforward archival um, research. And that became the base flaws of the Asia Society Museum. So this, what you're looking at right now. And we've got the big picture. We'd blown up the big seminal picture. So this one. Right. So this was from the 1949 exhibition. This is the first exhibition of the progressives. So this, the famous kind of six progressives. Um, and so we've blown it up, and what we have on either side is that we managed, like, quite painstakingly to try and recreate that exhibition. So as far as possible, we tried to recreate it. So you see, you've got a Sousa on one side, and we've managed to get one. And then there's another work here, oh, scene, that we've managed also to get. So this entire room was trying to see what was in that first show. Um, and I mean, I got quite obsessed with it. It's also really interesting that this is the element of the show that when the Indians and even the Pakistanis were coming to see it, and for the opening, there were lots of I mean, everybody from kind of our kind of art world came to see the show. This was the room that people were like standing there, and some were crying. And the owner of one of these works, I won't say which, is Dadiba, and the owner of another of these works, it was a New York collector, and they were so intrigued when they stood in front of each other's works, that they made a deal that for a while they would exchange it. I mean, I don't know if that actually happened or it was the spur of the moment kind of thing. But this was the room that for South Asians, and even, I mean, for me, that was really super super emotional, and I think for Bunhui as well. Um, but this was our room. This was the Indian art world room. It in the press, and this exhibition got a lot of press, and within the American art critics who were coming to see it, like, I had my ex boss, I won't say for which magazine, a very famous one, and he came and he was like, great show, Zara, the upstairs rooms just prove that there's an Indian art, because it just looks like an American modernism, which is a dialogue I'll come back to. But he said, the below rooms, I mean, like, yeah, it just shows that it's got great archival interest, but it's a little crap, no? And I was quite hysterically angry. I didn't talk to him for 2 months after that, but I just thought it was really intriguing that actually our inroads and what we're looking for as a South Asian audience is kind of really it's kind of different. So it's one show, but each lot of people found a completely different cultural significance. um, so yeah, here you have, and do pay attention to this little painting that is stuffed next to the photograph. Okay, so this was a key little painting that was found for us by very cleverly. It was Rob Dean and Connor McLean. So, like, as I said, this archival thing, everybody helped with the research, because they then realized that actually, what do we know about the progressives? There are too many narratives out there. So let's spin it down. So this is the group, right? This is the original six: Sousa, Ara, Gade, Hussein, Bakre, and Raza. And this is the painting that tells the actual story. Um, it's called the three progressives. So the three progressives that actually founded the six. And there was loads of dispute here as to, I asked Dadiba and he had sort of one answer. And I should have believed him actually, because he's the one with the best historical knowledge. And then Rob Dean discovered in Shelley Souza, daughter of Souza, who lives in New York, her Christie's auction, this little sketch had been included. So, really, really interesting. It's what this painting was then made from. And we were able through this to identify not just the six, but the original three. Um, and as Tadiba always said, but this kind of proves it, that each one of these original three invited somebody else. So, Hussein was brought in by Souza, um, Raza, and it was, I think it was, yeah. So Hussein was very much brought in as a second um lot, and you can actually trace from this little image exactly who they were. Souza, uh Raza, um Ara were the original three, who then bring in the Gade and Bakri. Okay, so this was the kind of popular imagination, and there are very interesting things that happen around here. So one interesting thing is, where does Akbar Padamsi fit into all of this? Um, and if you ask, traditional auction house law is very much that he fits as, he was central to the progressives. But the more reading I did, and if you go and ask Banu as well, his wife, um, she would say, yeah, definitely he was part of the progressives. Um, it's actually not true, because when I had gone to ask him originally, and I went to ask Dadiba was very adamant, Dadiba Pandor, that Padamsi was never part of the set. And the reason he was not part of the core team was that he was too young, and also he traveled with them. So aesthetically, there was a great deal of back and forth. But he, Padamsi himself never wanted to be part of a group. He was just not one of those people who felt it necessary to be part of the group. So there were all of these kind of little things, and because, as I said, anyone who can define themselves as a progressive, there's like there's such a huge monetary value to be gained by it. There are a lot of people, unlike an Akbar Padamsi, would be quite happy to be grouped within that category. And then there was that question of, Krishen Khanna, yeah, he's part of the group. But there are a lot of people you would talk to and they'd go, but where do you see him in the original? And yet it was actually Krishen's archives that saved us. So every step of the way, I kept going back to Kajali and going, can you just dig up more archives? Can you please dig up more archives? And then we found something really, really interesting. So this is what popular imagination, Hussein Raza, Ara, Souza, Akbar Padamsi, Gaitonde, Ram Kumar, Tyeb Mehta, Krishen Khanna. Less important because you don't really hear of them to that extent. Bakre, I think it's beginning to change, is a Gade Bakre, and not a progressive. So these two were, everyone I asked at that point were very adamant. Mohan Samant, no, not a progressive. Raiba, not a progressive. So just to say, obviously, this is incorrect. And this is where Krishen's archives saved us. So actually, even what do we count as progressives? Is something that is very much up for debate, because is it just the original? So the progressives only really had two shows, right? And the first show was the original six, so the legendary six people who poor part of the progressive. And that was 1949. But there was another show, and by this point in 1953, when there was the second show, there were actually new figures within this group. So some of the old ones stayed: Hussein, um, Gade, Ara. Um, However, there were a whole new group um, that joined, and core to this, and the person who actually wrote the catalog for this was Krishen Khanna, which is why we found all of this sitting in the archive. And also, like, if you look on the right here, so this is a little snapshot, um and there's a really confusing date here because it says 1949 and somebody has written it in, and we didn't it really threw us off the scent initially, because we were just like, 1949, this does not match up at all as to these names on the 1949 group show. But what they do match up with, of course, is, so even at this really early stage, like, one of the artists maybe had done this, maybe somebody else had done this, and it's just a photograph, right, that we found with the 1949 obviously penned in at a later date. So it's a construction of a myth, right? So these were never the 1947, 49 names. They were the 1953 names. So who's a progressive? There's also a second wave. And these are the people. So yes, Raiba is a progressive. You have, Raza Souza written into this, Hussein, Hazarnis, Gaitonde in the second wave, and there's Krishen himself, and these are his archives. And here you can see, uh, the progressives. Now, Banu is a, so another thing that was always said when I started the research and was going to Bombay and Delhi a lot for it, it was like, why you want to be so obsessed with this all male gang, huh? Why can't we correct it? And through this 1953 text, we actually found that Banu Ataya was there as well. So the one woman in the group actually joins in 1953, and she's invited to join by Krishen and the others, but particularly Krishen and Gaitunde took a huge interest in her. And you all might actually remember her not as a progressive artist at all, but as the first person to win an Oscar for Gandhi, for the costumes of Gandhi in 1982. And that's because she left this group and decided that, she became really famous, and it was a lot more lucrative to stop being a struggling artist and to go off and do um, to do costume design. So it was a really interesting sort of look at the scene, and it also helped then trace the early visual language of this scene, and the kind of work that we were kind of looking at. And what I was really intrigued in was that looking at the early 40s, early 50s, late 40s and 50s, artworks produced by people like Banu, by Gaitunde, and actually Krishen, Raza even, and showing the kind of similarities in the iconography. So part of what I was really intrigued with was, what were they looking at as they built this iconography for the new nation. So this is a Gaitonde work. I want you to look really carefully at it. It's an early Gaitonde, and it actually looks a little bit like the Ram Kumar head that is in Priya Show. That's a newspaper cutting we found to justify that relationship with Gaitonde and Banu. And Banu's daughter was super helpful. And this is the progressive artist group. So this is what they actually were. The core group, which you can see, the 1953 group show Krishen Khanna, Gaitonde, Mohan Samant, who was always considered an American modernist artist. In an Indian context, he was like too American to be included in an American context. I mean, he looked Indian, so he was too Indian. He fell between the cracks. He is now very much being redefined. The Tate has done stuff on him. He's part of their collection, and in fact, the Tate collected the work that Bunhui found with Mohan Samant's wife in a loft, and we put it in the show. And that's the very work that the Tate decided that they were collecting. And then Banu Ataya and Raiba. And the associates very strongly are Akbar Padamsi, Ram Kumar, and Tyeb Mehta. However, as we progress, I'll show you there's a sort of similarity in the kind of thematics as well. And here I wanted to show you. So this is Banu on the left, and this is Gaitonde on the right. So you can kind of see, right? There's a similarity in terms of iconography. Again, Ramkumar's head very much fits within this kind of rather boxy, a sort of breaking apart of form, figuration, so that it's almost abstract. So it's pushing the boundaries of that. And what's so fascinating is that at this period, they all kind of cross making this sort of work. They're all struggling with form. And when we usually think about the progressive legend, one of the things that we struggle with is the fact that they all had such different visual iconographies. um and they're known for different things. So Krishen Khanna, bandwala, figurative work. Gaitonde, abstraction. Ram Kumar, abstraction. But this actually shows you them all together sort of working out their visual languages, which kind of makes you think, where do the abstract tendencies actually come from? If they're rooted in the figure, then something different is going on than pure abstraction. And this is an argument I'm going to come back to. Really interesting. Again, you can see the relationship between Banu and Krishan Khanna here. So here is her nuns, and this is a really famous Krishan Khanna work, News of Gandhiji's Death in 1948. And you can see the similarity in time frame. So this is a work that the Krishan work is the one that we managed to have in the exhibition. And it was one of the works that was invariably the newspapers would cover this work. And I just find it really fascinating, just in terms of how these people are standing as well. And you can see that they're really like the peoples of India. There's a Muslim, there are Hindus, there, um, there's a, and it's the mass shared grief in Gandhiji's death. And I think when I asked him, he was like, "You keep seeing maps everywhere when they're not." But I almost feel, and I'll show you later on, it looks a little bit, for me at least, like the map of India. And here you have Ram Kumar fitting into exactly the same kind of, very boxy dialogues. These are really early works where they're talking about the peoples of India, and they're not kind of like talking about, the sort of um, they're talking about the real sort of the real India, the urban India that is dispossessed. So here you have unemployed graduates. In Hussein's case, he's sort of really interested in things like peasant couple, but it's not an elite India that is being discussed. It's the everyman that is in some ways being valorized as well. So here again you have, yeah, this is the sort of the actual progressive artist group. And then I wanted to kind of like close this section a little bit by talking about, now that we had it nailed down in terms of who was a progressive artist, right? And but I was also really, really interested at this point in the terminology of progressive. So why did they call themselves a progressive artist group? And also, like, remember that term progressive is something that has tremendous art historical significance, right? And in art history, particularly Euro American art history, for something to belong to a progress narrative is usually not in Asian art's favor. It's not in Indian art's favor. Because if you belong to, invariably, a Euro American art history will say, oh, Gaitonde, he's great because he looks just like Mark Rothko. So the idea that Indian art is derivative, which is the next bit that I will be talking about, really comes from this idea of a progress narrative, right? So I was curious, like, why that term progressive? Also, there's deep communist associations with the terminology of progressive, and Souza, was a member of the Communist Party, and their first meeting of the Progressive Artist Group was really held um, in in communist headquarters. So at that point, the progressive made sense. But then Sousa fought with them, and they didn't use those headquarters anymore. And the reason he fought with them was that he just didn't feel the PAG stylistically, they were much more revolutionary than what what a kind of communist idiom would have wanted. It was much more about form, much more about breaking up the figure and analyzing it in an aesthetic context. And that is not, that's not the kind of figuration that the Communist Party ever really liked. So even as he'd given up that that association, still there was that word progressive. And we managed to find, I think it was, again, it was Connor who found this article for us. Um, and it's in 1949, right? So this is on the eve of the progressive show opening up. In fact, he's writing about it. And this is Souza's article, you can see here, and he signs Secretary Progressive Artist Group. But the entire article is a critique of the term progressive. So, I mean, it's really kind of ironic that this is a term that is very much, it doesn't work to their advantage. They're rejecting it. Souza is rejecting it. And yet, history will remember them as a progressive artist group. And he signs off as president, a secretary of the progressive artist group. And this is on the eve of the first show. It's also the same year that then he goes away from India because he thinks it's not sophisticated enough to understand his kind of art, and he catches the boat and he goes to he goes to Britain after that. Um, so yeah, what makes progressive art? And so this is a very sort of live question. It was a very live question for the show, but I think it's something that we still need to think about. So as far as he was concerned, right, as far as Sousa, who became very much the spokesperson for that group, was concerned, that what the progressives were actually doing in terms of figuration, in terms of style, is, if they could be called progressive, and he had, as we know, he had huge issues with that term. What they were was revolutionary and radical. And there were two reasons for that. So, stylistically, they were breaking with convention. And this is what he says in the Patriot magazine. Again, a rather interesting choice of affiliation. Ganging up with the best and the most vital amongst us seemed a solution. That the formation of PAG coincided with the independence of India was symbolic, but he says it's just coincidental. What he was really trying to do was, he was trying to subvert the academic realism of the Raj, particularly the pastime efforts of the British Memsabs. So, the sort of pretty pictures. But he was also taking issue with an earlier phase of Indian modernism. Um, with the Tagores that had been obsessed with what he called sentimental paintings from the Bengal school. Now, really interesting that actually Amrita Sehgal, the other great Indian modernist, has a similar issue with this kind of sentimental painting. So there's much more of an equivalence. Obviously, with the progressives, they're pushing form even more than arguably Amrita Sehgal is. But there's a real issue with using oils, with being radical in terms of form, reclaiming oil painting from the academic realism of of the Raj, but also kind of deliberately undercutting sort of nostalgic, past-looking images of somebody like Abindranath Tagore and the Bengal School of Art. The Night of the Shalimar, the Emperor Shah Jahan. Again, super interesting after the Progressive Revolution exhibition, which was very, very Indian focused. I got quite obsessed with unpicking what Indianness was all about in conjunction with the progressives. um, I discovered, a lot of Pakistani art historians started reaching out to me, like Samina Iqbal, who focuses on exactly that same moment in Pakistan's history. So, in a Pakistani collective called the Lahore Art Circle, who are formed just after the progressive artist group, and they're using it as their blueprint because the person who's helping its formation is actually Raza's brother, who's on the other side of the pond. And interestingly, Raza's brother Ali Imam also, like that Lahore Art Circle, is also really obsessed with critiquing the Bengal School of Art and these sentimental paintings. So their great bugbear, if the progressives' bugbear is the Tagore side, their great bugbear is Chuktai. So basically, the Bengal School of Art in its watercolors and its sentimental past is what they all, South Asian modern is trying to smash at this point. And so I just wanted to then quickly take you, actually quite quickly, because I sort of want to start looking at where this dialogue has gone now, to a few things from the Progressive Revolution exhibition, and how we were addressing the idea of modern art for a new India. And really, at that point, taking issue with why Indian art. So this was very much an obsession with me at that point, and I'll argue that I think increasingly those of us who are working in this space are not so obsessed with this dialogue anymore. But at this point, it was very much an obsession of making sure that Indian art also entered a global modern, right? And really challenging the dialogue that you're hearing in the West. With the Indian moderns are just derivative. They are just like, so if you look at Tyeb Mehta at a particular point, he's just like Francis Bacon. You can see it here, so I put things together. And there's Giv Patel, who says the modern Indian artist was a favorite whipping boy for art professors, newspaper reviewers, and columnists. He was pronounced Western, rootless, imitative, and sterile. And certainly, when I was kind of growing up and used to visit India, I mean, I'd find some of these works on my grandmother's walls, right? And my excitement with Indian art did not start with the moderns. They almost felt like something one had to be a little bit ashamed with. And it was very much the contemporary. And contemporary art in the kind of, early 2000s was really cutting edge, was really kind of, pushing the boundaries out of the kind of the traditional format of painting, and was also very skeptical about these particular moderns, about the progressive artist group. And so I kind of had, I kind of understood this. And when I went to the Courtauld, and I was actually studying an MA on European modernism, and I wanted to write about Indian art. It's really intriguing that I didn't want to pick an equivalent from the progressive artist group, which would have been a natural or, an Indian modern from that period. I actually chose Atul Dodia, who is deeply critical of both of modernism per se. And I think it was quite telling at that point. And Bunmi and I had both suffered under it of, the Asian modern is kind of looked down upon. It's called derivative. So we wanted to challenge that dialogue. And we actually also wanted to assess the rights of this dialogue. This, by the way, is now, you will not find it anymore. That's why I put a date there. It was obviously state modern, is how I presented this quote. I mean, we all know it's state modern. And they took this down after I gave a lecture think it was at Christie's, and there were, young curators at the date sitting there who quickly fought with me afterwards. And the next time I checked, this quote was gone. Um, and it said, modernism refers to the broad movement in Western arts and literature that gathered pace from around 1850 and is characterized by a deliberate rejection of the styles of the past, emphasizing instead innovation and experimentation. Now, I mean, what's my problem here? It's obviously, modernism defined on Tate Modern's website as a Western movement, right? So it's like, how exclusive can you be? And again, I mean, they had just been the wonderful Gaitonde show that and then Podar had curated, and still you had this dialogue roaming around. Um, Gaitonde just like Rothko. Um, and here I want to show you the lovely Ram Kumar that you see. So, we can keep doing this. Souza, just like Bacon. Tyeb Mehta, just like Bacon. The dash that comes in for Tyeb Mehta, and I'll look at that late in very quickly now, just like Barton Newman. And yeah, I mean, you could look at this and you could say, oh, just like. And this is really, so this is a picture of the last room, the Asia Society's Progressive Revolution section. And this was the bit that the American press went wild with excitement because they understood it. But I also had, Bunhui and I were looking at the, so we had lots of people responding to the show, and someone left a message. I think it was a written message, or maybe he just left it with one of the guides, um, that, totally understand why this curator would want to make connections with Indian and Asian antiquities. But what about the obvious fact that Gaitonde looks like Rothko? Why is that lineage not analyzed? And, it so happened that my curatorial lecture came after this comment had come in. So, I mean, I actually addressed it and I said, well, why should I make that comment, or why should Bunhui and I care about making that comment when there are more than enough people like you to make it for us? We're not interested in that dialogue about how it looks just like. We're interested in seeing, what are the contexts to which these Indian moderns are actually drawing. So now I'm going to skip this bit. And take you just as a little deep dive into an alternative dialogue about, which is a dialogue that from this moment, for me, started becoming really important. And I noticed that curatorial, so where our interpretation of the PhD of the Indian moderns has really changed is that, as India itself grows in strength, the dialogue of, how are we going to fit in Western definitions and in Western institutions increasingly is not one that we're that bothered about, right? I mean, we're not going around asking, hi, is Raza, derivative of, it's not something that is our dialogue anymore. And I'm noticing when I teach in Bristol as well, it's just not a question that it's not a question that feels relevant. It's like, okay, you know what, if the global modern doesn't acknowledge us, so, Indians sitting on acquisition committees will correct the fact. And everybody wants Indian money right now, so it's happening naturally. But what is interesting is the fact that we keep revisiting them in an Indian context. And what I want to sort of now look at is how that revisiting is no longer a kind of Atul Dodia moment, which I would put myself in at the beginning, right? Of irony, of saying, where have the moderns failed us, and quickly blaming the progressives for this failure, of being really not sure how to take them. I think the revisiting now happens as a kind of deep dive into people's practice, where we're each looking for something, right? Answers maybe as to where we went wrong in terms of an Indian definitions of secular, perhaps looking at the political implications of what looks like purely formal choices. And, I'm the kind of art historian, for many people reading my PhD, they said I'm not an art historian at all. I could be, doing political philosophy, I could be doing lots of things, but it's not art history. So, I'm going to take that as a compliment, and I'm going to show you the kind of things that are now happening with these sort of quintessential moderns that really unpicks their figuration and their kind of experimentation with form. So I'm going to go beyond this bit, um, and look a little bit about G.D. Rockefeller III, and the India International dialogue, which Bunhui and I really addressed. Um, looking at why is it that we say, Indian modernism at a particular point, why does Gaitonde look just like Rothko? Or, what is that about? And so this is one adjustment of the derivative dialogue, is to say, actually, they were all part of a modern movement, and it was a shared modern movement. So Tom Keene was a representative of the Rockefellers, and he also had a collection himself. So this is a Hussein that came from his collection. This is a Ram Kumar. That can also be found in his collection. This is him standing next to Hussein, and I just wanted to quickly show you the extent. And Tom Keene was a representative also of the Rockefellers, right? So this is where we started adjusting the dialogue that Indian moderns had never been collected by the Rockefellers, because they had been. And what we were trying to do here was actually prove that forget about this derivative nonsense. It's that they were all looking at a similar kind of visual language. So it's not that one came first and the one came second. It was that this was a moment where there was cross pollination. So an India kind of international. And here you can see Ram Kumar, Krishen Khanna, Padamsi, Raza, Souza. And these are paintings, and they've all been written about by George M. Butcher. So these were works that we were tracing in Western collections, and I'll show you a few more. So Blanchette Rockefeller collects Raza's Village Witch Church. I really obviously wanted this for the show, and Bunhui and I struggled really hard. We were promised it, and then I don't know, I think the owners decided to sell it at auction because we had been so excited about it. Or maybe not, I don't know, because I never saw it at auction after that either. And this is another Padamsi that was owned by the Rockefellers for Rockefeller Plaza. And I just want you to look at the iconography, right? And the building up of this modern dialogue. And it's going to be important now with the sort of 60s, very late 50s in this case, of a kind of a breaking apart that a lot of these moderns had from figuration to explore abstraction. But I have a point with this kind of abstraction, right? I don't think it is. It's just about form, and I'll show you why in a minute. So this is Gaitonde, looking just like Rothko did, by the way. So a lot of these artists, Gaitonde, Krishen Khanna, and be interested to know about Ram Kumar. He was certainly collected in America, as you can see here. Um, uh, you know, they met Rothko, and they were on this Rockefeller grant that allowed them to travel all over Asia, but also to America. And this was Gaitonde. And what I was kind of trying to argue with this, so we placed these two works next to each other, was to show that both Gaitonde and Rothko were actually, yeah, there was the visual synergy, but the synergy was because Rothko was also looking at, Japanese and Chinese scroll printing, just like Gaitonde was. So, in a way, their influences were the same. So if anybody was derivative of anyone, it was, a Gaitonde draws on his own Asian past. Um, and so again, this is kind of looking, this is Kajali Khanna, by the way, my bestie and also co-curator for the Krishen Khanna show. And this is a work we discovered. I say we, but actually it was Dara Mehta and um, Minal Wazirani, who went and bullied the staff at this. It was the very famous Benjamin Britten and Peter Pear's home called the Red House, which is in, it's not in Norfolk, it's in Suffolk. Which so they are sort of pioneers of what amazing modern art. But Benjamin Britten is the great kind of opera, the reinventor of British opera, and we realized through this discovery that this is a Krishen on the wall, and it was bought in 1962 from Leicester Gallery. So. When Kajali and I wrote to the archivist, who was really really excited, we met somebody there who was so fascinated. They took lots of pictures of Kajali standing next to this work, and they sent us the receipt so we can actually track that it was in Leicester Gallery, it was sold from there. And Peter Pierce had actually he knew Christian, so he'd bought this work and then he met him a little bit later on in India itself. So I just wanted to show you that in the 60s, through these Rockefeller grants, but also, through sort of cross cultural conversations, there was a huge interest in travel within Asia and exploring an abstract language. So just as Gaitonde was looking at scroll paintings, you also had Krishan experimenting in the 60s with Sumi ink. And so this is something we are going to be putting into the Krishan show, is to really look at the 60s, 70s moment. But what I also, want to point out, and this is kind of where I'm going to be ending it all, is the idea that this abstraction is not just a formal choice. It is also it's also potentially a political one, because what is happening by the late 60s and 71 is the formation of Bangladesh. And what the more research that Kajali and I have been doing, ironically, as I'll show you, this exhibition that we're doing comes out of quite a long investigation that we had for personal reasons. We got obsessed with trying to make her granddad talk about partition, and I'll show you how we had a breakthrough. So this is the photograph that Priya, you all sent me from your exhibition, and I want to know what this protest in 71, given that that's the year of the formation of Bangladesh, is all about. But what I'm seeing is that abstraction in the 60s is not it's not just about form. I would argue that if we look at the abstract practice of some of the artists who we take for granted are the great abstractionists like a Ram Kumar, like a Raza, that perhaps it's that division of space that starts to happen in the 70s, as a follow through of the breakdown of the figure in the 60s, is actually inspired by political, by the political fissure of the nation. So one argument that I'm trying to kind of make is that there's a revisiting of the seminal partition in 1947 that starts to happen in the 1970s, and that for various psychological reasons it becomes easier to do this through abstraction, um, uh, to deal with that idea of fissure. And so here's Raza, and this is his Zameen, homeland. So Zameen obviously means earth, but there was an exhibition that Pooja Vaish curated called Homelands, which she asked me to do an essay for, and I just focused on this one work, and its similarity to a work he did on Bangladesh. And obviously the date is quite telling. So I kind of read it, and I think Pooja wanted me to, because we had done a series of talks online on Zoom together with Peabody Essex Museum, called Mind the Dash. And this particular Mind the Dash was all about Bangladesh in 1971, and you can see that Zameen, which is from the Jahangir Nicholson collection, was used on our poster. And so I think from that, she got really obsessed and she decided she just wanted to do a show that actually unpacked the politics of this moment. And Raza is someone who is often considered, just abstract. It's not about representation of any way and in any way. And this is kind of something that I think one can start challenging. And it's also at this point that we start getting these deep dive exhibitions, as I was saying, of curators really wanting to look at a particular oeuvre, or sometimes in a particular moment of an oeuvre, and find things in there. And I was just going to ask, it's really easy as well to say Ram Kumar, totally abstract. Um, it's all about the form. But is it possible, given what else is happening with figuration in this way that actually talks about the second partition, that these 70s works could be a reflection? I mean, Gaitonde, there is a work that I kind of wanted for the show that actually showed almost like a map and a division of a map. And this obviously was made in 71. So I wonder about this. And this is something that Kajali and I really want to explore in the Krishen exhibition. So this is a Tyeb Mehta from the Progressive Revolution that we didn't put it together with the Barnett Newman, but I just wanted to show you the dialogue that was still very, very strong at that point, which is that Tyeb Mehta, obviously, he goes to America and he's influenced by Barnett Newman, and that's when you see in the 70s that the diagonal comes in. But you look at this work with the dismembered physiognomy and you think, really, he's got to be talking about partition, right? And it's what's so strange is that the line, that diagonal, is not the Bangladesh line. It's made in the 70s, but it's almost like an opportunity for these guys to revisit the seminal partition, the first breaking apart of the idea of India, as it were. um, Both Raza and Tyeb, obviously Muslim artists, um, but Gaitonde isn't, and nor is Christian. And so this was a work that was in the show. It was called an anatomy lesson, and I lined it up alongside this, just to ask that question. That when we're talking about abstraction, we can also talk about the significance of abstraction to the politics of the 70s as to what is actually happening here. And with Krishen Khanna, the anatomy lesson, it becomes really, really clear for me at least. This is why Krishen used to say, I keep seeing maps where there are no maps, but it looks to me like they're dividing up. The generals are dividing up something. And the something looks remarkably, for me at least, like bits of the map of Bangladesh. Again, and why the obsession in the 70s with this image, this operation image, the anatomy lesson, the generals, and then there's this one as well, which is also Dharameta's work. It's going in the show. And again, it's another kind of anatomy lesson, a kind of cutting up. So it's, I think, called Chirag at the operating table. And this is kind of like my summing up, as it were, of how I think we can go with the progressives as a kind of um, looking at this, sort of re-looking at them in a much closer vein, and trying to pick apart what is actually going on with the iconography in a way that actually relates to our current political moment. And I would argue that a lot of the shows that have happened lately, which revisits them, the curatorial notes on them have been about that, rather than pumping up a larger myth of the progressives for commercial reasons. And perhaps that's why we continue to be fascinated by them. It's because they do hold a sort of clue as to a slice of Indian history, and their particular secular angle into it, right? And that's, I think, why they're important as well. So a few more things. So before I end, is that this is the kind of connection that Kajali and I were making, was that, when we first asked him on a panel at the Courtauld about, how come he never painted but the 1947 partition, he clearly told us that he had never painted it. He said, Kajali and Zara, when you have huge trauma, you do not sit down and paint it. You need to process it. And then afterwards, Kajali and her dad kept finding these 1947 works. And one of the works that we're going to have in the show, so this will, I think, all be in the show, is so this work. Was a work that Kajali's dad found in the waste paper bin, almost, because it's almost like, he thought, oh, it was too badly damaged, and suddenly, with the restoration of this work, with COVID, he starts giving interviews, and he gave Rima Gehi an interview which said exactly the opposite of what he had said on that panel. And he talks about the 70s, he talks about the migration paintings of the 70s, and he says, obviously what I was doing was I was revisiting partition. And so these are the things we're lining up. So I mean, really, what we're doing, and you can actually see this quote, the images, the refugees waiting on the train, the 18 hours, so talking about the ghost trains of 1947, and that this particular black truck is a reminder of that. So the second partition of the subcontinent becomes a reminder of the first. So this is another image I painted from memory nearly 3 decades after witnessing it. Partition didn't happen over a day. The migration happened over several days, weeks, and months. Animals and people, along with their belongings, were all shoved inside trucks and moved from place to place. So, these days, sort of South Asian historians have called it the long partition. And this is something that I think we can really go back to, the Indian moderns. And I think we can see the traces of that. So this is kind of where I am ending.
Hi, Zara. Thank you so much for that really enriching lecture. Your insights have not only deepened our understanding of the PAG's modernist legacy, but has also challenged us in thinking of how we, think about and revisit art history today. Before we move into the Q&A, I just wanted to ask Priya if she wanted to respond to your question earlier.
Yes. Firstly, thank you, Zara. This was riveting, to say the least, and such an insight into the optimist as well. All the inferences you've drawn have left so much food for thought. But quickly wanted to talk about that image that you brought up. So this is actually part of the protests that were led by artists against the Lalit Kala Academy between 1969 and 1973.
Okay, so
They were
nothing
sparked by
at
this.
all. So why were they protesting against it?
So yeah, so Academy's initiation of the second finale around the time. So this is when the artist community felt that the organization was plugged with mismanagement of sorts, and including issues related to the selection and funding. So that's when the protest movement started and developed confidently across different contexts and called
complete reconstitution of the academy itself. So that's where it comes in. Yeah. One
Sarah,
second, I think I can't hear you. I
Yeah,
don't know
that's
why.
really interesting. So this is also proof of,
Yes,
how
sorry.
sometimes when I'm trying with desperation to stuff something into one dialogue, it doesn't necessarily fit in there. But would you, I mean, obviously the reading that you are giving is kind of, it's from a different angle. So it's like looking at Ramkumar's letters, and
Yeah.
would you say that, he is apolitical, that it's all about form in that way? Is it
No, I I actually feel there's a lot more to read here. And what we're doing is by presenting all of these different writings, right? And his fictional work as well points into that direction, that he is drawing into a lot of socio-political things that are happening. And when he travels, and there are records of this, when he's in Paris, he's hanging out with certain artists with certain ideals, and it shows in his written work a lot. So knowing that and then connecting that to the abstract work that he's doing gives us a sort of window into that thought. So it's definitely not apolitical, and there's a lot of room there to discuss and find out more, I would say. So this is probably a start at looking at this in that direction.
That's super interesting. I mean, this argument kind of like uh I found a line in Sonal Kular's book,
Yeah.
um, in modernism, that actually looks at the 70s moment. And it's at, and I think she does that in the context of Hussein. And it's that kind of like, and it was just like a throwaway comment towards the end. She's really clever. And that is actually the thing that started us off, me and Kajali, like looking
Yeah.
emergence of the diagonal. And that was her point, that if you looked at Hussein in the 70s, there was a diagonal that came in as well. So the same moment that Tyeb is discovering that diagonal, so is Hussein.
Yeah.
And it kind of got me thinking that actually, uh, let's start looking at all of them at this period. And
Absolutely. I think especially now we need to revisit and relook at all of these in a different light, because a lot has been missed. I mean, a lot of dots can be connected here, like you're saying.
Mm. Would you say, sorry, like now quite full on, I mean, do you think that there is something that happens to Ram Kumar between the 60s and the 70s, that, that we could anchor it? Like the 60s, you can definitely see there's a moment of exploring
I don't
abstract,
know. Hello.
but hi, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Can you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, so I mean, in the 60s with Ram Kumar, you can definitely see. I mean, I didn't have time also, but you could see a synergy between what's happening with, say, Krishen, and the investigation of Sumi Inc., Gaitonde, and the sort of breakdown of form that, ironically, all of them go through this in the
Yeah.
in the so kind of very American influence in one way, but also very East Asian influence. And you can kind of see there's a 1961 work or something in your show that really, like, if you put it next to a Sumi Inc. work,
Mhm.
and Christian have synergies. But I wasn't sure if what I was doing with the 70s work, they look kind of similar. Um, uh, but I'm not sure that I could read that politics in without feeling like I was forcing a dialogue.
I think that's where the writing here sort of helps. I don't know if it's a stretch, but that's somewhere even I am at, where I want to read up more and more of Ram's writing at least, and try and draw an inference between what he was thinking about in that moment and where all he traveled, who all he was hanging out with. So I think that's the bit of research that can still be worked on and be understood a little better. But I definitely do feel there it's not a stretch to make those connections. There's definitely something there.
Do we have, do we have any questions or?
Yes. So I'll just start reading them out. So the first one is, to what extent does the continued influence of Western critical frameworks over Indian modernism reflect a kind of cultural dependency, and how do we move past that?
Yeah. Uh, okay. Yes, there is, and I'm basically an academic operating out of Britain. So it is very much. I mean, it is very much a a struggle in that sense of making sure that something like in Indian art, Pakistani art, like, South Asian art generally, um, gets inserted into a dialogue about the modern per se without having to talk about an alternative modern or, a tropical modern or, various ways that, look inclusive but are actually exclusive. And I think it starts at the point of art history, right? Um, now the tackling of this, it's so derivative. um in a kind of way, it's gone off in two directions. In one case, for the auction houses, it really doesn't matter, because I mean, who get, people are buying it. So it's got a status. um but for art historians like me, it just particularly operating out of the West, it feels that an argument still has to be made. And the truth of the matter is, perhaps, I mean, I don't know, one will reach a stage within Western academia where you just feel, actually, who cares anymore? Like, really, who cares? If you still have to fight to make this dialogue, it means that, it's maybe it's not a fight worth having in a British context. Like, just go somewhere else. But ultimately, it's a dialogue that needs to be addressed through art history, because that's the space where art is defined. So for us to have an art history, must be, I mean, it's something that a Singapore curator and academic, Jeffrey Say, and I have been discussing a lot, because he's got a program on Asian art as an MA program. And it's something that, like, we find, and I've taught on that program before, and it's something that, we find a lot when we're dealing with Western, European and American institutions, is that a lot of our texts, our seminal texts, are actually curatorial texts. Are actually things that within mainstream art history are not even acknowledged as art history. So there's a continuous sense of, how does the library collected? How can I put it on my course? Because, it's not open access in an academic vein. These don't exist at books. They're one-off books on exhibitions, some of which are out of print. So I think at some level it's a systemic thing of, the more of us there are, to curate these exhibitions, to ask these questions, and then to publish. um, that's the way we really address.
Thank you. And I also had a sort of similar question. I was, wondering, with your upcoming retrospective on Krishen, how do you and the co-curator as well, are rethinking and reframing this work within the broader modernist narrative? Because as you said, it is quite derivative, and these complexities are explored within the exhibition itself. So um, yeah,
I mean,
how are you doing that?
first of all, I would not use derivative anymore, because I think it's it's I think one needs to think of the modern in a different way. It's not about who came first and who came second. If you look at Gaitonde, you can say he's deeply derivative, right? Um but you can also look at Rothko and say he's deeply derivative. And that is because they're both deeply derivative of a particular kind of East Asian scroll painting. So in a kind of way, saying, having that kind of progress narrative on the modern is itself a problem. So let's not say derivative so much as, multinational, multicultural, different kind of streams. And I think the biggest sort of challenge within this is, for me particularly, I think Bombay is a very interesting space for a kind of progressive dialogue, is to hang on to that idea of the secular, because what is the secular that these guys stand for? Um, and obviously, that terminology of the secular, that's what's looking dated right now. And so, what to claim from that, and how does, you know, how do we do justice to Christian's oeuvre, as well as ask new questions in a space like the NJMA, which comes with its own huge problems. Some of them are just like really technical problems, like, the Bombay thing has to deal with the Delhi side. Suddenly we find that our main dome has been taken away. Some things that are quite, so it was a show that we wanted. We were collecting about 130 works, and suddenly we're going to have to cut it down because we don't have the dome anymore. So I think a lot of, to keep the kind of intellectual rigor of it and deal with the practical aspects of it is what is going to be our real challenge. I mean, Kajali knows the work absolutely inside out, right? It's her granddad. She really, really knows the work. But how do we kind of, and it's also a question of the fact that, at Asia Society, ultimately, whatever I wanted within reason, I could have. It was a show that was meant to be 50 works, it grew to 180 works, and they survived it. They fundraised for it, and they gave it the space that ultimately they felt they needed. But here, it's also a question of, you know, every collector here has in some ways got some input, because they're helping us finance it. So it's the how to like not get bogged down in things that neither Kajali and I really, I mean, I'm an idea curator, so it's and you know we're both in different ways used to working with institutions that do all this stuff for us. She helped hugely with the Asia Society show, honored it, but this is a complete challenge in every way, and sometimes it's just like um who's going to do the transport, and she's found somebody. Like, we still don't know who our exhibition designer is. We're looking for recommendations, so it's that, like, and so how do you balance the practicalities of working in an Indian institution with then also having sort of conceptual weight?
Yeah, that is, that is a very valid question, and I think something that all of the different institutions here are dealing with. But thank you also for sharing, the different ideas that you're thinking about during this exhibition, and we can't wait to see it come to life.
Can't wait. Like, let it be over.
Yeah, I think that if there are no more concluding thoughts from anyone, we can close. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time and for the really insightful lecture. And thank you to everyone else for staying on, for asking your questions, and also from us, to let you know that there are a lot more events and programs related to this exhibition happening at the physical museum. So please do keep an eye out on our website and social media. But thank you all again. See you. Have a good evening.